Hello everyone, my name is Nero and this is the channel L'Islam Spiegato da un cane. Welcome back to those of you who already know me and welcome to anyone who's here for the first time. Today's conversation will be extremely important and delicate for many reasons, not only because of our guest, whom we are pleased to have with us today, but also because I've always approached the topic we are about to discuss with some reluctance, and shortly I will explain why I feel like that. Today, we'll discuss the Israeli Palestinian issue over a year after the events of October 7. But before I invite the person who kindly agreed to share his story with us today, let me briefly explain why, as a channel, we've mostly stayed a step back from this issue. First, I don't have much knowledge on the subject, and I've always been quite open about that. In one of the most ideologically charged conflicts in history, I believe that anyone without expertise or first hand experience can only reach conclusions that are unlikely to add anything constructive to a situation that's still unfolding in full view of the world. Secondly, I believe that ethical and practical considerations come into play. Good informations require knowledge, skills, and resources. This channel is mainly focused on exploring the origins of Islam, revealing its problematic aspects, and highlighting the challenges and sometimes the dramatic consequences for those who live Islam. Moreover, it's difficult to see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict purely as a religious issue. If we were to look at it solely through the lens of religious sentiment, we would also need to discuss how the rhetoric of the opposing side has, especially in recent years, incorporated religious elements too. This channel, however, doesn't have a team, reporters, or the financial means to provide an objective analysis of a conflict that is still happening as we speak. Modern warfare is increasingly fueled by propaganda from both sides, producing mountains of information whose accuracy is hard to verify, even for those with a far more resources than we have. Lastly, before we move on to our guest, I want to clarify our stance on this issue one last time, a stance that unfortunately doesn't fit easily into traditional categories, which often pit opposing sides against each other, making calm debate nearly impossible. You can criticize Islam and still oppose what the Palestinian people are suffering, both before and after October 7. To quote from the beautiful book by Arturo Marzano titled This Land Has Always Been Ours. Sorry, Professor Marzano, I did the translation of both the title and the quote myself. And this is the quote. One can and should simultaneously condemn October 7 and everything that has happened since. One can and should support the existence of both Israel and Palestine. One can and should support the rights of all people living from the river to the sea, that is, in the land between the Mediterranean and Jordan, both Israelis and Palestinians. This is not fence sitting. It's a recognition that the right to self-determination belongs both to Israelis and Palestinians. So, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce one of the most knowledgeable, brilliant, and balanced content creators you will find out there. So, welcome to Secular Spirit. I'm adding you now. Ciao.
Hello,
Marhaba.
marhaba, and thank you so much for glowing praise to introduce me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, but it's not finished yet.
Oh, there's
So,
more. Okay, continue
yes,
flattering
yes,
me, please.
I'm about to finish. Secular Spirit is a former Muslim and content creator. I strongly recommend you guys to subscribe to his channel now. So, tonight we'll have I hope so, but I'm sure about it, an in depth conversation covering almost everything about his personal journey. Mm, As an ex Muslim and as a Palestinian, with a perspective that I think defies expectations, especially for those accustomed to relying on cliches, I had to put it outside my chest. Here we go. I say we are ready to begin with the questions, if you agree.
I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about your religious background? Were you a devout Muslim before you leave?
Sure, yeah. I wouldn't say I was a devout Muslim. I would say I was more of a typical Muslim. So I came from a Sunni family, and I lived for the most part in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, in the Gulf region. And by typical Muslim, I mean I believed in Islam, I believed in God, and I practiced a lot of the things that many Muslims practice, praying, fasting during Ramadan, so on and so forth. But I wasn't devout because, as some reviewers might know, but some might not know, you're supposed to pray, for example, 5 times a day,
Mhm.
which I always found very, very challenging.
Mm.
I would almost compare it to, and I think a lot of Muslims feel this way too. It's almost like trying to stick to a diet where you have good days and you have bad days. And some days you do all 5 prayers, and then others you just get busy or you're too tired. And so I was that kind of Muslim. I believed in everything, but I wasn't adhering to everything as much as I knew I should. And of course, the thing that comes with that, and this is something that I think, especially maybe your viewers in Italy, being Catholic, the guilt comes.
Of course, I I have some hand experience about that. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just to talk a little bit further about my experience of growing up Muslim, there's a lot of different influences that can come into your life when you're living in a Muslim country compared to a Muslim immigrant in, say, Italy or Canada, where I live today. And by that, I mean there's the family influence. And I would say, in my case, my parents, my immediate family, were not very religious. We had the Quran in our home. And like I mentioned, we would celebrate Ramadan and the big Eids, kind of like Christmas in Christianity, every year. And yet I did notice that my parents were even less devout, you could say, than me. They didn't pray as much as I did, for example, but we did all of the Muslim things. And so there's that family influence, and then there's the societal influence. And I would say that one was the one that had a more profound impact on me in terms
Mm.
of my religious upbringing. I went to a school in Dubai that had Islamic education as a course, a class. So similar to so it would be English and then math and then Islamic education. And
Mhm.
my Islamic education teachers, I had several, both of them were named Muhammad, which is, I guess, not that surprising, were very big influences on how I learned Islam and how I practiced it, and uh, how it became a very important part of my life. So even with the guilt from not doing everything, I considered myself very much a Muslim, and I viewed the world from an Islamic lens. And by
Mm.
that, I mean, I saw everything in the world created by God. God had a plan for me and everyone else. And there was also Shaitan, the devil, that was tempting us into sin. And I had to be very careful not to be tempted into sin, because then I would end up being judged in judgment day and sent to hell, which was something I was terrified of as a young child. And I also felt very strange and terrified because I really did feel and believe that God was watching me at all times. So anything I did that I knew was bad, and I didn't do anything that bad, to be honest. So, maybe stealing a pencil or, things
Mhm.
like that, lying to my parents, things like that. So I would feel incredibly guilty about that. And that increased even more so when I reached my adolescence, my puberty, and began having, sexual desires and
Yeah.
feelings, which I think in Middle Eastern culture is shamed a lot, and I felt very shamed for having sexual desires and feelings. and guilty before God, because I knew God was watching me if I was watching, let's say, porn. Where I wasn't blaming Islam, I wasn't looking at Islam, but I was still Muslim. I was still practicing. I was still fasting, but I had all this inner tension. And then when I finished secondary school, I moved to Canada for university. And that's where things really changed, because I left my family, I left my community, my support networks. I was in a place that wasn't a Muslim majority country. And that's where the Muslim influences around me were definitely not as noticeable or significant. I was left to my own devices, you could say. And that led me to really question a lot of the things that I took for granted in my life, because I was wondering, why am I here in Canada? I didn't really have a passion or interest in the subject I was pursuing in university. I did it because it's the next step in life. And all that questioning of what am I doing here led me eventually to questioning Islam. And I have more to say about that, but I just want to let you ask me any questions if you want about all that.
When you changed the environment, all these struggles, internal struggles, assaulted you in some way. So, and what was the last drop? I mean, there's a specific topic, because there are always these. Everyone that I came across, which happens to be an ex-Muslim, has always a last drop, some specific topic that led them to say, okay, it's over.
That is very typical. I could mention, for example, I have a younger brother, and for him, he left Islam a couple of years after me. And for him, the last drop was looking at the injustices and suffering in the world and thinking, there's no way the God of Islam could be real and allow this to happen, which I guess you could commonly say is the problem of evil with people's belief in God. For me, that didn't convince me. That wasn't the reason I left, because I always was taught that, you know, if there are bad things happening to you, if you're suffering, you see horrible things happening in the world, it's all part of God's plan, and they are tests from God, and all we have to do is trust in Him, and it will all make sense one day. So that was not the reason I left. The reason I left, I could say, and it wasn't one immediate aha moment. It was
Okay.
more a gradual process over a year, where I realized that the reasons I believed in Islam were not ones that were true to me or that made sense to me. And by that, I mean, I just had this realization that I was always told that Islam was true by my family, by my teachers, by the world around me. And now that I wasn't in that world anymore, I saw not everyone believed this. There were people who were atheists, there were people who were non-religious, and of course there were people who believed in other religions like Hindus and Buddhists, although some argue that Buddhism isn't a religion. That's a whole other but I saw that there were other perspectives, other beliefs, and that made me think about how there was really this different standard for everything in my life, and then a separate standard for Islam. So by that I mean, would you believe that there's things that you can't see, things that you can't touch, things that you can't experience in your day-to-day life? Like, would you believe someone saying, "Oh, there's a dragon outside the house who's going to burn you alive"? You wouldn't, because you can't see this dragon, you can't feel it, you can't experience it. And yet somehow I was believing these things about a God watching me at all times, a God who created everything, a God who has a heaven and hell ready in an afterlife that no one could really experience or prove is true beyond faith. And that's when it shattered for me, when I realized that I had no good evidence for believing in any of the core claims of Islam. And I started thinking, what if this is not real? What if it's possible that it's all man-made, just stories we've told ourselves to comfort ourselves? And when I started looking at it that way, I just couldn't believe anymore.
Just to add some personal notes to this, I know, I've grown up in a Christian environment, but I can't really call myself a Christian. I think I've never been really a Christian. I've just been raised in a Christian family, but what made me just realize that it was all made up was studying anthropology. You know how the religion came into the world just after, in some way, magic. My professor of anthropology at the university always taught us that magic is the mother of religions, and by giving us books to read, some books are now considered in some way old fashioned, like Fraser, old anthropologists, but there you can really have a grasp of how there is a genesis of myths that then in some way make religious babies. They with time and space they can travel and shape shift in some way and make other new religions. And this is very fascinating to study, and but they can contribute to make some form of antibodies against religions. Anyway, let's go back to you. And how did your family and friends react to your decision to leave Islam? Did some of them have had some bad reaction after you spoke about your apostasy?
Well, this is where my story is like a little bit different, and maybe you could say not as dramatic as the experiences of others who leave Islam. Before I get to that, I just wanted to mention, the thing that's so interesting about the people who claim, well, we've always had these religious stories for these myths. Like there's always this story of a great flood or of a one God, things like that. They use that as almost evidence that it has to be true because it's been around for so long. But what if it's one of those things where it's just believed because it's been around for so long? So people just keep transmitting it over and over again. And just because it's been something passed down, that we automatically assume it has value, which I think is not
Mhm.
always the case. And maybe that's something anthropologists look into. I'm not in that field. But I always thought that that's an interesting thing where when you're a believer, it has power. But when you don't believe, you just see it as what it is, stories.
Yes,
Yeah. But anyway,
exactly.
side tangent for that. But yeah, so the thing that made my experience a little bit different is the first thing to note is for many friends and family, even today. So I left Islam when I was around 17, 18. I'm 35 now. I haven't told them I have
Mm.
left Islam. So in
Your
my family,
face
let's
is on the YouTube, so sooner or later they will
Ooh,
know that.
yeah,
Even
I
though.
guess it's one of those things where, for anyone watching, I don't use my real name in the
Mhm.
channel. So if you were to Google my actual name, you wouldn't find the stuff. Uh, but I decided, it's important to show my face just to be able to reach more people and to show that I'm a real person doing this, especially when it comes to the subject of criticizing Islam. Is just using my name as well was a step too far for me.
Mm.
And my safety, concerns about my career, because it's very controversial to talk about Islam, which might be
Yeah.
something we address in a little bit. But yeah, maybe one day people will discover in my life, and I decided I'll cross that bridge when I get there. But yeah, uh, a lot of people, my family and even friends, don't know I left Islam. They don't know I do this channel. That's
Oh.
for sure. And for my parents, what I did was, as I was questioning these things, I started dropping little hints here and there,
Mm.
making, you could say, like jokes about Islam or God, or questioning little things like that. Like, for example, one thing I might have said was, uh, when you go to heaven, when you go to paradise, are you the age that you are
Mm.
when you die, or are you your optimal age, whatever that means? Like maybe some people, their optimal age is 30, others 20. And the other point I think I made was, let's say you fell in love with you're a man and you fell in love with a woman, uh, and you had a family together, and then she died for whatever reason, and then you met another woman and fell in love with her and had a family with her. When you go to paradise, who who do you live with? Do you split the house with both of them? And so I was basically making these little jokes to point out maybe the absurdity of Islam with my parents, and I found them to be generally receptive. And so I finally just revealed, you know what, I just don't practice, I don't believe anymore, and they were accepting.
Oh, wow.
Thankfully, yeah, yeah. And I think the main thing that makes my story unique and actually shows the dangers of Islamic influence, especially when you're young, is I gradually discovered that my parents were pretty much non-religious, like non-practical. You could say they may be cultural Muslims, non-practicing, but they pretended they were religious for the most part because
Oh,
we were
they were in the closet, so
maybe you could say in the closet, but it's more
closet.
a case where they omitted certain things about how they felt because they didn't want to negatively impact my brother and
Mm.
I, because we were living in a Muslim country and very young and impressionable. And I guess the fear was, I'm sitting in class as a 10-year-old and I say, "Oh,
Mm.
my mommy says God isn't real."
No, of course.
So, which would get all of us in trouble in who
Yeah.
knows how many ways. So I think they decided to just play it safe there. And the thing that was, in my opinion, a risk with that was that they allowed other influences in my life to impact me religiously. And I alluded to that earlier with my Islamic education teachers in school, where I took what they taught me as more important than what my parents taught me because, they're representing the word of God. And so I listened to them to a great extent and disregarded even some things my parents would say. For example, if I said I was afraid of going to hell, my parents would say, "You're not going to go to hell, you're a good person," and so on and so forth, to comfort me. But I
Mm.
didn't listen to them because what do they know? I should listen to my Islamic education teacher whose expertise is Islam, not my
Mm.
parents who don't even pray 5 times a day. So uh, my
So
my
we're
parents,
judgmental
yeah,
towards
yeah.
your parents
Oh
at the
yes, yes,
point.
exactly. Which
Ah.
is which is scary to think of when you're just 12 or 13 and you're looking down at your own parents. Like, what do they know? So eventually it went well with telling my parents, but I have much more religious relatives who I've never told,
Mm.
including ones that live in Palestine, because they would just look at me completely different and it would probably affect their relationship with my parents. And I didn't want to do that. And similarly, I did have a few Muslim friends around the
Mm.
time that I left, and I just didn't tell them. I just kept that
Mm.
private, and I pretended like I was a lapsed Muslim. So, someone who just couldn't be bothered doing all the things you're supposed to do, but still was a believer.
I have now a question because, I can relate for some things you're talking about. I have this family. I'm married to an ex-Muslim myself, and I love some of most of them. With them, I have some troubles because of, I think, cultural differences. But with most of them, I have a very good relationship. And doing what I do now here, I feel sometimes I betray them. You have this feeling?
I do sometimes have this feeling, especially when it comes to the subject of Israel and Palestine. So I want to save it because I know we're going to talk about that later. What I would say for now is I don't feel guilty about it, but I do. It is the reason why I don't address those things with them. And it's because Islam is such an integral part of culture, community, identity in the Muslim world. And I would say, based on my experiences, more so than what I've seen in Canada, for example. I'm not sure about Europe as much. And so when my feelings towards Islam, when I bring them up, it's not just criticizing religion, it's criticizing those Muslims in my family, in my community, and it's attacking their identity. And so the feeling of guilt could come from them, even though I don't feel it. And I think that's one of the problems of a religion like Islam, how it has become interwoven with people's lives.
Okay, and here we are to the controversial part of this interview, and let's talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the
Where to
7th.
start? Where to start?
Yeah, and the 7th of October aftermath. I got to see and appreciate your last videos in which you mentioned the intense emotions going around the Israel Palestine conflict discussions. And I think that whatever we might think about it, we absolutely cannot deny a certain polarization of opinions as a fact. You mentioned how you experienced firsthand what you call the unchecked emotionality of people talking about the conflict during a conversation you had with an Israeli guy. Can you elaborate this a little bit for us?
Definitely. I mean, I think just to add some context to what I mean by unchecked
Yes, of course.
emotionality, in this case, the thing with people who are Palestinian and people who are Israeli is that the whole issue of Israel and Palestine is something that is, again, deeply core to their identities and their lives in all of these important ways. So it's understandable that there would be a lot of emotion when it comes to the subject. When to just kind of briefly summarize, when you're talking to an Israeli, uh, it's their ancestral homeland that they've been promised by the God that they believe in, and it's a sanctuary from what has happened to them historically, of course, like the Holocaust, but beyond the Holocaust, just being outcast and marginalized in so many countries around the world and banished from so many countries around the world. So they see Israel as this sanctuary that must be protected, that is core to their religious identity as well. For Palestinians, they see that land as their homes, their communities where they've built roots for centuries in some cases, and definitely centuries in the case of my family. And tied to that as well, it's the land that is one of the most important in Islam, so it has a religious value as well. And there's that sense of injustice from both sides when it comes to that emotionality. So, from Palestinians, where they feel like their homes have been stolen by Israelis, and Israelis, where they feel like the world has been unjust to them. And now when they finally are able to go to their land that was chosen for them by God, they're now being threatened by the people around them.
Mm,
So by unchecked emotionality specifically here, I mean where, because of how emotional important this issue is, that emotion takes over, where reason and compromise and even just simple logic of looking at things in terms of working with others or the realities on the ground of what's happening uh, are lost. And
yes.
so, to talk about the specific conversation I had with an Israeli recently that I talked about in my video, what happened was I did my initial video reacting to Israel's retaliation against Hamas in October after the October 7 attack. And the most important thing I mentioned in that video, and this is something this Israeli reacted very emotionally to, was the 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 Hamas attack didn't occur in a vacuum. There's a lot of context to why it happened, and the Israeli state has a lot of blame to be leveled against it for why this attack happened in the first place. Again, not justifying what Hamas did, but it's more about understanding why it happened. And I see it as people lashing out against an occupation that has been going on for decades. And when no political solutions were possible, some, like Hamas, have turned to violence.
Mm,
And this Israeli reached out to me to basically ask me my opinion on this and to question it. And I was open to this conversation, even though it would be like a very heavy one. And I had never talked to an Israeli who lived in Israel. He lived in Israel about this before. And I found him to be, generally receptive to listening to me. But I noticed that he would question or doubt or undermine a lot of the things I was saying. For example, I would make a point about maybe potentially a two-state solution, and he would say something like, the more you talk, the more it feels like you don't have a real understanding or grasp of what's going on over there. So he would say a lot of little things like that to undermine me, which I felt was odd. And then I started thinking, what was his motivation for talking to me in the first place? Because as much as he did allow me to speak, it didn't seem like he was accepting anything I was saying. And beyond just accepting what I was saying, it didn't seem like he saw any value in it. So I started wondering, is this person just talking to me because he wants to vent his frustrations about what is happening in his country, and specifically his frustration that people are considering Israel to be an aggressor or to be in the wrong in any way, shape, or form with what it was doing in Gaza? The big question he kept on asking me, so what's Israel supposed to do? What's Israel supposed to do? And this is what led to the big tension moment where he actually yelled at me. And I said, Israel needs to overhaul the entire system. It's not about, using less violence or bombing less or targeting areas without civilians, which I would totally advocate for. But these are surface level issues for what the core problem is. And that's the system of occupation. And I would also call it an apartheid state that Israel is
Let's
running.
call it with its name,
Yeah.
apartheid.
An apartheid state. And what I explained to him is, you could wipe out Hamas, kill all its militants, and that won't address the problem. Hamas will return, or another group similar to Hamas will return
Yes,
using
and Sinwar is
violence.
dead right now, and nothing changed.
No, because
Exactly.
there will be short-term impacts, obviously, of losing leadership for any organization like that. But the core problem is the system, and people will always still lash out against the system. And I suggested changing the system, and this is something that I could tell he had trouble accepting. And when I suggested as a possible avenue to changing the system, this was purely hypothetical, not saying that I believed in doing this. I suggested, what if there was a, 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 a possible avenue where Palestinians were given equal rights as citizens? All Palestinians were given equal rights as citizens in the state of Israel. And he lost his temper there. He accused me of advocating for genocide by even suggesting such an idea. And his argument was that Palestinians all want to genocide Israelis, and if they became citizens, they would make that happen. And I was genuinely shocked at that moment. And I realized, wow, this is the level of unchecked emotionality about this, where just suggesting the idea of giving people equal rights was seen by him as equivalent to advocating genocide. And I tried to explain to him, you are talking to a Palestinian who accepts that Israel should exist, a Palestinian who doesn't want Israelis killed, a Palestinian who is not the only one who feels that way. There are many in my family and many that I have met who feel the same way. They don't want the destruction of Israel, but because he just saw Palestinians as this one group, one monolith that wants to
A
destroy
monolith,
Israelis, he lost his temper. And last thing I'll mention about this before I turn it back to you is, I did do a video talking about how we had this conversation that ended so poorly with him yelling at me. I did mention to him that I was going to do that, and he said that I should re-examine what I say, and that he could see the hatred in my face as I talked about Israel. And that really stunned me that someone could say that about the stuff I do, the content I make. I I really suggest to anyone watching this right now, watch my face in those videos. It is not the face of someone who's talking with hate. It is someone who's trying to talk from a point of understanding. I don't even lose my temper or yell or shout in my videos, unlike other content creators.
Yeah.
So it just made me realize how distorted his view of me was, and how that really was the obstacle in resolving this conflict. And I have more to say about that, but I just want to turn it back to you before we continue.
How much has the conflict to do with religion, in your opinion? Is hate against Jewish people a thing among Palestinians? You just mentioned, actually, that many people tend to see Palestinian sentiment as a monolithic, that everyone wants to see Jewish people dead, exterminated. It's really like this. Do we have a problem of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish people among the Palestinian or Islamic people? Is it really a thing?
That's a very good question, and I wish there was a simple answer to it. But if there was a simple answer to it, then this conflict would have been resolved a long time ago. This is something that requires a lot of nuance to explain and understand, because there's truth to both sides in viewing this matter. So I would say that religion is an important factor in the conflict, but it is not the key factor. A good way of explaining it is this way. So when you talk to someone who's like a Palestinian boy who's 12 years old, or if you talk to me when I was 12 years old, and asked what I thought about Jewish people, about Israel, I would say a lot of hateful things when I was 12 about that. I would say a lot of angry things, saying Israel needs to be destroyed, Israel is evil, the Jewish people are trying to destroy our country. But the question I would ask then is, where does that motivation come from? Does that motivation come if you're talking to a Palestinian boy in Gaza who just lost his entire family, maybe was maimed in the bombing as well? Where does the motivation for saying those hateful things, which I think are wrong, but I'm just trying to explain them right now, where is it coming from? Is it coming from Israelis being Jewish? Or is it coming from the actions of the Israeli state, from Israeli soldiers and what they've done in Gaza, what they've done to Palestinians? And I would say that the motivation is coming from those actions, not from them being specifically Jewish. But that's the way hate and anger works. It
Yeah.
turns it
They
into
want to
this.
simplify things in order to explain them.
Exactly. So it becomes this thing where it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where
Yeah.
the Israeli state worries about an anti-Semitic hatred destroying them, and so they lash out against Palestinians, and then Palestinians lash out with an anti-Semitic hatred. So that's what I mean by how, while religion is an important factor, it isn't a key factor. At its most basic case, the the core factor of the conflict is two different groups of people trying to take the same land, and in the case of the power dynamic today, and for many decades, uh, since 1948 and perhaps even before then, it's a case where the Israelis have had more of the power and have used it disproportionately to oppress Palestinians. That's as simple as it is, and then the religion comes afterwards. That's a thing that can kind of get blurred, and there are blurred lines in it, but it's important to note what comes first. And so the last thing I'll say just to answer your question is, I would say the majority of Palestinians, even though there's no polling I can use to prove this, although there is polling to say that a lot of Palestinians support Hamas, the majority of Palestinians, I would say, are anti-Semitic in their hatred of Israelis and Jewish people. That's just a given fact, but not all of them. I think that's like a key distinction to make, because Palestinians, just like Israelis, are not a monolith.
What do you believe is the main reason for dehumanization of the other side in this conflict? Do you think it's symmetrical, present on both sides? What steps do you think individuals and communities can take to reduce this? Just your opinion about this.
Well, I would first start by saying the reason for the dehumanization is one of those tragic aspects of human nature where it's just easier to do that with your enemies. When you use dehumanizing language against your enemies, and this is something that is sadly universal about human history. If you look back at so many examples, when you describe your enemies as dogs, as villains, as demons, as inhuman, whatever it is, it makes it psychologically easier to kill them, to oppress them, to destroy them. to vilify them. And this is something where there is a religious element to it, where if you believe, let's say you're a Muslim and you believe Israel is um, an entity of the devil, an entity of demons, it's easier to justify violence and hatred against them. And the same thing goes the other way, where if you see Palestinian Muslims as this demonic entity, then it's easier to do horrible things to them. And this is something that we've seen with how Nazi Germany viewed
Exactly.
Jewish people, Gypsies, Polish people, Russians in World War II, and there are so many historical examples. I'm sure
Yeah.
people watching at home can think of. So
I
it just makes it easier to do horrible things, unfortunately.
Yeah, and justify violence towards groups. I was just thinking about the Nazi Germany that made this narrative against Jewish people, saying the most horrible things against them, but even creating a sort of legends. But in the Middle Age of Europe, there was a literal persecution of Jewish people, and they were,
Yes,
yeah, making up stories about them. There were even legends to describe them as monsters, that they were bringing disease. All the most horrible stuff were invented to create a monster which was less immoral to attack. But even if you think about going back to anthropology, uh, it's to transform your opponent as a devil is necessary in some way to give a free pass to violence.
of course.
Yeah,
It's Can you imagine trying to kill someone knowing that they have, parents that love them and children and spouses and the community and experiences just like yours? It would make it so much harder.
yeah,
uh, because none of us are monsters in the end. What ends up happening for people who do horrible things is they find some way to justify them or suffer psychological repercussions, which I think is what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine today, unfortunately. And to answer your next question, which was about is this dehumanization symmetrical? Is it
mhm,
equivalent between Israelis and Palestinians? I would say, talking about specifically Israelis and Palestinians that are in Israel and Palestine, like in that region, uh, it's hard to make a difference. Like, I think it's largely equivalent. Both
mhm.
sides dehumanize and demonize each other. But I want to make a clarification here to show why there is a key difference, and that is again that power dynamic that I
Yeah,
mentioned.
yes,
The Israeli state is in the position of power with
yeah,
vast military resources, political support from major Western powers like the U.S. and
exactly.
uh, and they've used that power to then further dehumanize and demonize and oppress Palestinians. Now, this leads me to a question where some people speculate, well, if Palestinians had all that power, then they would do the exact same thing to Jewish people. And this is one of the reasons why there's an argument for against supporting a Palestinian state. And for that, I would say that isn't a legitimate reason to deny people equal rights. Uh,
Exactly.
and none of us can read the future exactly. And while there would definitely be a lot of problems, and I'm not denying that,
Mhm.
the solution isn't to just continue oppressing an entire people. It's about finding a compromise that works for both, or at least is tenable to exist in practical reality.
Yeah, and I don't think that like bombing everything moving is justified by because they have the worst idea in the world. Nobody deserves, despite their ideas, to be exterminated like this.
Definitely
So,
not. Yeah. And to answer just your last question, what can be done to
mhm,
just address this dehumanizing thing? I think it comes down to building empathy, building understanding of the other side. And I really think, especially because of my background as a writer and journalist, that
mhm,
it comes from storytelling. It comes from sharing the perspectives of others that you normally wouldn't listen to. And I think that's vitally important from the side of those who have the power imbalance. So the Israeli side, to understand the plight of Palestinians, to understand their perspective, and to then see them as human beings where they can compromise on what they're doing. And by they here, I mean the Israeli state, where uh, it's making a peaceful resolution almost impossible with things like continuing to build and expand settlements in the West Bank, making it more and more difficult to ever create a Palestinian state in the West Bank by fragmenting it. So they're doing this and a lot of other things that just make it difficult to do that. And while this isn't, the most practical solution, sharing stories and all that, it is what's necessary to stop demonizing others, is to see them as human beings just like us, and to look at our own unchecked emotionality. I understand for Israelis that they see Israel as their chosen land, as their sanctuary, but it cannot come at the expense of stripping other people of their freedoms and their rights.
Yeah.
And just to say that this isn't just about Israelis, for Palestinians, it's to stop demonizing Israelis, Jewish people, as monsters, as a monolith that's just bent on oppression, because we have to find this ability to separate ourselves from our anger and frustration with what's happening to Palestine, to accept that Israelis are human beings too, that deserve a home, that deserve rights, and that they're not going anywhere, because Israelis leaving would lead to a disastrous humanitarian crisis. So that's a non-starter. So for Palestinians, they have to also see the humanity of Israelis and accept that they should have a home too.
I totally agree. And yet, when we try to talk about the conflict, the state of art among the ex-Muslim scene is still, to this very day, very tense. And the same is with their communities. I can see it in your comment section and sometimes in mine too. Because of your expression of closeness with Palestinians being an ex-Muslim, which seems an impossible equation to some, you have been accused of spreading lies through undercover dawah. How can we overcome this oversimplification of thought? Do you think there's still hope to overcome these cliches?
It's going to be very difficult because, unfortunately, as we talked about, that element of dehumanizing being easier and more appealing to human nature, that applies to what you just described in terms of how some ex-Muslim content creators are viewing the entire situation, and how people around the world are just viewing it as extremist Islamist terrorists who are just bent on destroying Israel because they're Jewish. I think the key to doing it is the hard work. It's the climbing of the mountain. The reason why the situation, this conflict, is so intractable right now is because it's so difficult to climb that mountain of nuance, of showing the complexities and humanity of the situation. And so it's going to be very difficult because, for example, when you ask me the question of, is religion the core issue in the conflict, how long did it take me to answer that question? Like 6 minutes. And it wasn't easy to explain it. And I'm sure that there will be people who will pick apart my explanation, but that's what's needed. It's not better to just have the quick 20-second response of, oh yeah, they're Muslims and Muslims hate Jewish people. It's in the Quran, the Muslim holy book, that Jewish people should be defeated or killed, or they can't be trusted, or whatever. It's very simple to do that, and you can put it in a nice, controversy-seeking little easily digestible clip. But just because it's easier doesn't make it right, and just because it's harder to do those nuanced arguments doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. It's just not going to be easy.
But the problem is that people want easy things, easy
Yes.
facts, digestible things.
Yes.
And but this is an impossible task because war is hard, war is difficult, war is full of false information, is fueled by propaganda, and propaganda is becoming every day more sophisticated. And those who say that the first to die in war is the truth is totally right. And we should divide our personal story, our feelings, our gut feelings. I don't want to appear rude or judgmental here, but I think that many of them are still driven by unchecked emotionality, because taking them away from religion maybe gives them that unsolved feeling of rage towards the religion which they have to solve sooner or later.
I can speak generally
Mhm.
if you would like without mentioning names. Uh, what I would say is I've seen instances in the English-speaking ex-Muslim space on YouTube specifically where people are viewing the Israel-Palestine conflict through a far too simplistic
Yeah,
lens
I
that
agree.
has kind of surprised me in how they lack empathy and
Mhm.
understanding for Palestinians and dismiss their suffering and almost blame them. For example, they'll say, well, they support Hamas. What do they expect? When you have this kind of dismissive view of human beings that are just like you and me, people who are, you know, living incredibly rough lives,
Mm.
young children, there's clearly something that's gone wrong when people can just talk in such a unempathetic way about those
Mhm.
people. So I think what it really comes down to, unfortunately, not claiming like I have all the answers or I know everything, but I think it comes down to a little bit of ignorance about the reality of the situation. And sometimes I do
Mhm.
question what their sources of information are and how much of their, perspective on the information that they consume is colored by their personal anger towards Islam. Something I've always done, I've tried to do as much as possible in my content and my thoughts on Islam is to separate the religion from the people, to try and focus as much as possible on criticizing the religion and the religious ideas and not the individuals themselves. And sadly, that isn't always the case with a lot of other people in the space, the ex-Muslim space.
And do you feel that social media algorithms, which often favor sensationalist and polarizing content, contribute to escalating tensions about the Israel Palestine war?
It definitely seems to be the case with Israel and Palestine, and as we've seen in the last week or so, or I should say last couple of months, with the US election of Donald Trump and Kamala
Yeah.
Harris, where what the algorithms are interested in to me seems to just be things that drive more and more engagement, and people are just more likely to comment or share something if it provokes a strong negative emotional reaction. And so what we've seen with Israel and Palestine, although I think it's encouraging to see how much of the plight of Palestinians has been shared across social media and really opened the eyes of a lot of people, it's also led to this furious cycle of, I would almost say, futile aggression online, where this person attacks this person and then this person attacks that person, and they both end up leaving thinking exactly the same things they did when they went in, and that is definitely not productive for anything.
Yeah, because they are just discussions in a bubble. So, you have recently been to an event in Oslo which focused on dissent and secularism. How was the experience in general? How was it like to see in person your ex Muslim colleagues, such as Apostate al-Din?
It was fascinating and sort of surreal. So it was called the Celebrating Dissent
Dissent.
Conference, and there were many prominent ex-Muslims there. Mariam Namazi,
Mhm.
a Canadian journalist by the name of Ali Rizvi, and many more that I could mention, like Apostate Aladdin. And shout out to Haram Doodles. Please check her out on Instagram if you can. She does a lot of uh, Islam critiquing illustrations, definitely worth checking out. It was surreal because I had only been, up to that point, I had only been doing this kind of content online. So just me in my apartment talking to a camera like I'm doing right now, or, just commenting to people that I'd never met or seen, didn't know what their faces looked like. And what it made me realize is that while the online space is criticized for a lot of maybe valid reasons, it actually does have this incredible power to connect people. I wouldn't have connected with all these people from all over the world without the power of doing this online. And I think this is the power that ex-Muslims can use to really change the conversation about Islam and uh, to help normalize leaving Islam, is using the online world to connect in ways that we couldn't in our day-to-day lives for a lot of safety-related reasons, and then to come together for something like this event I went to in Oslo to help share those ideas. And one thing I should mention, Apostate Aladdin is surprisingly tall. So that was one cool thing as well, just getting to know the people behind the online personalities. Yeah.
Okay. What's the biggest obstacle to freedom of speech around religious criticism today, especially within Islam?
Wow. I think I I think it's two different things. So the first thing is something I already mentioned, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long, and it's the fact that a religion like Islam, but it's true for any major religion really, I think, is that the religion is tied to a person's identity, to their community, to every aspect of their lives, and this is especially true for Islam. So it's hard to have that freedom of speech to criticize it or to leave it because, especially in the instance of Islam, where leaving Islam is considered a great sin that, according to many interpretations, is punishable by death. So that's the obstacle, how interwoven it is in the culture, in the identity of the believers. And the second point I would make is, and this is specifically talking about freedom of speech when it comes to the subject of criticizing Islam in the West, and I'll talk about North America, which I know a bit better than Europe, is that there's this big focus from people who are well intentioned, I think, of not wanting to oppress or marginalize minorities like the Muslim communities in those countries, like Canada and the US. And so they try to put all these safeguards and protections uh, of criticism of the values, the teachings of Muslims. And the problem with that is, while it does make sense in one way, because there are problems of xenophobia and hatred of people from Muslim majority countries, just because they happen to come from those other countries, because they're foreigners, there is that problem, and something needs to be done about that. That doesn't mean that we should just accept all the values of Muslims, especially when it comes to their views on homosexuality or women's rights. So that's the real obstacle. We need to find a way to navigate that really difficult and challenging obstacle of accepting people from other parts of the world, but not just turning a blind eye to the
Yeah.
problems that they might bring in terms of their values.
And just one small question about Palestine. Do you still have someone there? How are they doing?
Yeah. I don't have family in Gaza. Most of my family's scattered around the world, which is very typical
Mm.
for Palestinians.
Yeah.
But I do have a lot of family in Jerusalem itself,
Mm.
and so they're thankfully safe there because the conflict generally doesn't hit Jerusalem, and the Palestinians that live in Jerusalem have much more in the way of rights and freedoms of movement compared to Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza. So they're doing well, thankfully.
Mm.
And here's the difficult thing: those are some of the most religious and devout Muslims in my family. So I have a very difficult relationship with them where I can't really be myself
Okay.
because they don't know that I've left Islam. They don't know that I do this stuff criticizing Islam. And while I do still care about them, that will always be a divide between us. And part of that divide is their views on that Israelis are, wicked and deserve destruction. And that's something I could never agree with, and is always a sore and sensitive subject whenever it does come up, because the least thing I could do, even if I don't disclose that I'm no longer Muslim, is to stand up against that kind of rhetoric when I hear it in my own family.
Okay, let's go to the last question.
Okay, let's do it. Wow, it really flew by.
Yeah. What advice would you give to young ex-Muslims who want to speak out but fear the backlash?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of advice I would give. The most important one being that do it in a way in which you don't endanger yourself. So depending on your situation with your family and where you live in the world, there might have to be several precautions you have to take. So you could use a pseudonym like I'm doing, and omit that you're doing this with family and friends. You could use an avatar like you use, for example, to keep your identity even more secret. And of course, there's instances like Apostate Aladdin and Infidel Noodle where they actually use masks to protect their identity and safety. So I think first thing to note is do it in a way in which you're safe and you're not endangering yourself, because the consequences for some, as we've seen across the Muslim world, can be very dire, and it can lead to a lot of harmful things. So number one is safety. Number two is actually something that you mentioned, and I completely agree with it. And I think it's important to wait until you've gone past that initial angry at Islam and Muslim stage before you start criticizing Islam and doing content about that. I remember when I first left Islam, I was enraged. I felt like I was lied to, and which I was, I suppose, or deceived, maybe you could say. And I just wanted to lash out against Islam and Muslims and just hate on it and mock it as part of my process of getting over it. And I think it's a bit dangerous to do that because, again, we don't want to dehumanize Muslims, and it's important to focus on Islam as a religion and as harmful ideas, because in the end of the day, Muslims are actually the biggest victims of Islam, those who still practice and believe, and they're the ones who suffer from it, even if they don't acknowledge that Islam is the source of their suffering. So I think it's really important. This is the advice I would give. Wait until you feel like you're ready in a way in which you aren't just criticizing Islam through unchecked emotionality, but you're doing it from a place where I feel like that I'm doing it from, where I'm trying to do it because I want to help people, Muslims and ex-Muslims alike, to shed the harms of this religion.
Okay, I think we are done. So thank you for being with us tonight. And
thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yes, it was a pleasure for me too, and it appeared so quick. We just finished. Okay, and thank you everyone for being with us today, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao, ciao, ciao. Bye, bye.
Ciao.